The house still stands, half-eaten by vines, its white pillars cracked like bone. Locals call it Magnolia Vale, though no magnolias bloom there anymore. They say the walls remember screams. They say the portraits were painted twice. Once for the living, and once for the ones born in secret. On the southern edge of Jefferson County, Mississippi, there lies a bend in the river where fog clings low and the ground remembers footsteps. It was there, in 1843, that Magnolia Vale Plantation loomed like a monument to pride. Built of pale timber and iron nails, it seemed less a home than a warning. Its windows always closed, its shutters trembling in the wind like eyelids forced shut. The master of this house was Colonel Thaddeus Barrow, a man whose wealth was whispered rather than praised. He owned 132 enslaved souls, 3,000 acres of cotton, and a family name that stretched back to Virginia. But beneath that lineage was something no church would bless and no preacher dared name. Neighbors described him as dignified, educated, a veteran of the Creek Wars. Yet behind his polished boots and linen collars was a hunger that no victory could quiet. He saw the world as breeding stock, land, animals, even people, and believed that perfection could be engineered through control. His wife, Eleanor Barrow, had once been the jewel of Natchez society, but years in that house had hollowed her face. She spoke softly and seldom, avoiding mirrors after the birth of their first child. Some said she'd gone mad. Others said she simply learned to look away. The Barrows had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, but by 1843 only one daughter remained, Clara, 16, pale and quiet as frost. The others had taken ill, though no physician's name was ever written in the record book. Beyond the main house stretched the slave quarters, 20 cabins deep into the trees. At night, faint hymns drifted through the dark, low, mournful, like confessions to a God that refused to listen. And in those cabins, the people spoke of the master's other children, the ones who looked half like Clara, the ones who worked the fields but carried the Barrow jawline. Visitors sometimes noticed it too, a familiarity in the eyes of a young field hand or a servant's face that mirrored the mistress's own. But no one spoke aloud. Not in that county. Not in that year. If you lived in Mississippi in 1843, would you have dared to question a man like Thaddeus Barrow? Because the few who didn't live long enough to ask twice. On the southern edge of Jefferson County, Mississippi, there lies a bend in the river where fog clings low and the ground remembers footsteps. It was there, in 1843, that Magnolia Vale Plantation loomed like a monument to pride. Built of pale timber and iron nails, it seemed less a home than a warning. Its windows always closed, its shutters trembling in the wind like eyelids forced shut. The master of this house was Colonel Thaddeus Barrow, a man whose wealth was whispered rather than praised. He owned 132 enslaved souls, 3,000 acres of cotton, and a family name that stretched back to Virginia. But beneath that lineage was something no church would bless and no preacher dared name. Neighbors described him as dignified, educated, a veteran of the Creek Wars. Yet behind his polished boots and linen collars was a hunger that no victory could quiet. He saw the world as breeding stock, land, animals, even people, and believed that perfection could be engineered through control. His wife, Eleanor Barrow, had once been the jewel of Natchez society, but years in that house had hollowed her face. She spoke softly and seldom, avoiding mirrors after the birth of their first child. Some said she'd gone mad. Others said she simply learned to look away. The Barrows had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, but by 1843 only one daughter remained, Clara, 16, pale and quiet as frost. The others had taken ill, though no physician's name was ever written in the record book. Beyond the main house stretched the slave quarters, 20 cabins deep into the trees. At night, faint hymns drifted through the dark, low, mournful, like confessions to a God that refused to listen. And in those cabins, the people spoke of the master's other children, The ones who looked half like Clara. The ones who worked the fields but carried the Barrow jawline. Visitors sometimes noticed it too, a familiarity in the eyes of a young field hand or a servant's face that mirrored the mistress's own. But no one spoke aloud. Not in that county. Not in that year. If you lived in Mississippi in 1843, would you have dared to question a man like Thaddeus Barrow? Because the few who didn't live long enough to ask twice. By the summer of 1843, the house at Magnolia Vale had become unnaturally quiet. No laughter, no piano from the parlor, no chatter of servants daring to hum a tune. Only the slow rhythm of rocking chairs on the upper balcony, the creak of wood that marked the passing hours like a clock wound by grief. Inside, Eleanor Barrow sat motionless for most of the day. Once the belle of Natchez society, she now moved like a sleepwalker, her hair streaked with white though she was barely 30. She refused visitors, covered the mirrors, and forbade her daughter Clara from leaving her sight. But Clara, restless and pale, slipped away each dawn to wander the fields where the mist clung thick and heavy. The same fields where children who shared her eyes bent under sacks of cotton. Eleanor saw it too. She knew the resemblance, though. She never spoke of it. The girls in the house, the maids, the laundresses, the nurse who cared for her, all bore fragments of her husband's face. One had his nose, another his jaw, all of them his cold gray stare. At the dining table, Thaddeus sat at the head with a silence that smothered the room. He demanded that meals be taken in order, prayers recited by rote, and conversation limited to scripture. When Clara asked why certain children in the quarters looked like kin, her mother dropped her glass, and her father's hand struck the table with enough force to crack the wood. That night, Eleanor wept in the dark, whispering to no one. "They are ours," she said. "All of them." In the quarters, the enslaved whispered that the mistress was losing her mind. Some said she'd found one of the ledgers, that she'd seen her own name written beside a list of pairings. Others said she'd tried to take her daughter and flee, but that Thaddeus had caught them by the river and dragged them home by their hair. No one could say for certain. But Clara's eyes changed after that. She stopped speaking in her soft, girlish voice and began staring through her father as if she could see the rot beneath his skin. And then, one morning, she appeared at the servants' well, not dressed in lace but barefoot, her white nightgown torn at the shoulder, and whispered to the kitchen girl, "He's making us the same." That night, the singing in the quarters stopped. If you lived there, would you have dared to ask what she meant? Because at Magnolia Vale, silence was safer than truth. The ledger was bound in cracked leather, its edges blackened by candle soot and sweat. It sat beneath Thaddeus Barrow's desk, a desk carved from mahogany imported from Havana, gleaming in the dim light of his study. No one was permitted near it. But the overseer, a lean man named Hiram Coyle, had once joked that the book held more souls than a preacher's Bible. He wasn't wrong. Eleanor found it by accident. The night she discovered it, rain beat against the plantation windows like a warning. She had come to the study searching for laudanum to quiet her thoughts. Instead, she found the drawer unlocked, and the ledger waiting like a confession no one wanted to read. The first pages listed names, men, women, their ages, their strengths. The language was cold, mechanical, good breeding stock, sturdy hips, docile temperament. But as she turned the pages, the handwriting changed. It became intimate, familiar, her husband's hand. Then came entries that should never have existed. C. Barrow, age 17, paired with S, strong breeding potential, monitor progress. The world tilted. Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth to keep E from crying out. It wasn't just Clara. There were initials, EB, CB, even references to offspring noted like farm yields. There were sketches in the margins, rough outlines of faces, of hair color, of height. Each page a blueprint of corruption, disguised as control. Outside, thunder cracked over the delta, and Eleanor dropped the book. She could hear footsteps above her, Clara's footsteps, pacing. Or perhaps it was him. The thought turned her blood to ice. She stuffed the ledger beneath her shawl and fled to her room. By dawn, she'd burned most of it in the hearth, page by page. But one sheet had drifted away, caught in the draft, and carried through the hall like a ghost. It landed near the servants' quarters, and by morning, half the plantation had whispered of what it contained. Hiram Coyle was the first to confront Thaddeus, not out of morality, but out of fear. "Sir," he muttered, voice trembling, "they're saying the mistress found the book. You best keep her from talking." Thaddeus only smiled. "There's nothing she can say that God hasn't already forgiven me for." That same week, the mistress stopped attending meals. Smoke was seen rising from her room each night, and the overseer swore he heard someone sobbing prayers in a language that sounded older than English. Tell me in the comments, do you believe a man can own his own sin? Because at Magnolia Vale, Thaddeus Barrow was trying to breed his into flesh. By midsummer of 1843, the air over Magnolia Vale had thickened with rot and silence. Even the cicadas seemed to hush when Thaddeus Barrow stepped outside. His presence carried a strange gravity, not fear exactly, but a kind of exhaustion, the way a field goes still before a storm. The women in the quarters whispered that the land itself was rebelling. Cotton plants were yellowing too early. The creek that once ran clear now shimmered red at sunset, as if the soil was bleeding. No one dared mention it aloud, but the overseer, Hiram Coyle, began spitting into the dirt whenever Thaddeus passed, a secret gesture to ward off the curse. One morning, a field hand named Isaiah collapsed near the cotton rows. His body trembled, his eyes rolled back, and from his mouth came words no one could understand. The preacher called it fever, but the old slave woman, Nora, who was said to have the sight, whispered something different. "It's the blood fighting back. The blood knows what's been done." That night, she gathered a handful of workers by the fire and told them the truth of what she'd seen. The mistress crying by the ashes, the paper that drifted through the hall, the names written like curses in the ledger. She said the master had turned God's order backward, making blood circle itself, twisting kin into chain. By morning, rumors spread through the fields like wind through cane. Some said Thaddeus's daughters weren't fully human. Some said their eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, reflecting something that wasn't there. Others swore the babies born that season cried with voices too deep for their sighs. Thaddeus noticed the silence among his people. He noticed how no one met his eyes. He noticed the way the slaves started marking their doors with symbols drawn from ash. When he demanded to know who started it, Isaiah, still half delirious, pointed to the earth and said, "The field told us, sir." The master laughed then, a sound brittle and hollow. "The field belongs to me," he said. "It speaks what I tell it." But that night, when he woke to find his boots filled with mud and his window fogged from the inside, even Thaddeus began to wonder. He pressed his palm to the glass, and for a moment, the condensation outlined a shape. A hand, smaller than his, pressing back. Outside, the creek ran dark again, carrying the color of iron and memory. Would you have stayed on that plantation, or run before dawn? By late summer, the Barrow daughters had grown into uncanny reflections of their father's will. Clara, the only acknowledged child of Thaddeus and Eleanor, had a gaze that seemed too old for her 16 years, sharp, calculating, and disturbingly still. But the other children, born in secrecy, carried something different, a quiet awareness that unnerved the most seasoned workers in the fields. The 9 girls, scattered among the quarters and hidden cabins, often appeared at windows, their eyes tracking the master's movements with a precision that made the overseer shiver. Some claimed they whispered to one another in the dead of night, language unknown, yet filled with meaning, a silent rebellion that no grown adult could interpret. Others swore the girls' stares could make grown men tremble, as if they carried the weight of every injustice the plantation had committed. One humid afternoon, a visitor from Natchez, a distant cousin of Eleanor, arrived to inspect the plantation's finances. The girls appeared at the veranda, lined like sentinels in white dresses that matched the glare of the southern sun. The cousin froze when he noticed their eyes, gray as ash, unmoving, yet all-seeing. I've never seen children so still, he stammered. Mara, one of the enslaved women tasked with the youngest children, pulled him aside. She whispered, "They have learned the eyes of the master and the eyes of the blood. They see everything, even what we dare not speak." Night fell heavy. Clara sat at the window, watching the shadows stretch across the fields. She felt the pull of her secret siblings, the children she could neither love nor touch openly. The ledger had marked them, but not their spirits. Something lingered in the corners of the plantation, a force both fragile and sharp, born of the unnatural union Thaddeus had orchestrated. That evening, a shriek tore through the quarters. The visitor ran toward the sound, heart hammering, only to find one of the hidden daughters standing by the creek, arms outstretched, staring at the moon. Her eyes reflected the water below, and in them, he swore he saw not one, but 9 faces, staring back at him, whispering in a chorus of silent accusation. When he turned to flee, he saw Thaddeus watching from the veranda, calm as ever. Yet even he paused at the sight of the children, recognizing for the first time that something had grown beyond his control, and Mara, standing in the shadows, whispered, "To no one." The master bred them, but he could not contain them. If you had seen those eyes, what would you have done? Step closer, or never return. Beneath the heart of Magnolia Vale, a secret breathed. No ledger mentioned it, no map recorded it, yet everyone who worked the estate knew, or feared, its presence. A trapdoor, disguised beneath the rug in the kitchen, led to a narrow staircase carved into the soil and timber. Only Thaddeus, Barrow, and a select few knew its purpose. The hidden quarters were small, suffocating, and suffused with the scent of damp earth and fear. Candlelight flickered against stone walls, casting shadows that seemed to shift when no one moved. Here, some of the enslaved women were sent after nightfall. The air hung heavy with quiet screams that had long since turned to resigned silence. Those who entered never returned the same, if they returned at all. In these quarters, Thaddeus conducted what he called his lineage experiments. Women of childbearing age were kept under watch, their daily movements logged, their health inspected, their bodies catalogued as if they were livestock. The master's obsession had reached a fevered peak. Only children who exhibited his desired traits were permitted to remain. Others were quietly sold or sent elsewhere. Eleanor, having discovered traces of these quarters after the ledger incident, understood the depth of the corruption. She caught glimpses of her husband descending into the hidden stairwell at odd hours, carrying lanterns, carrying secrets. One evening, she tried to follow. The stairwell gave way to darkness, and as she descended, the air grew cold, unnatural, pressing against her lungs. She heard muffled cries, whispers, and the unmistakable sound of a child's soft sob. The rooms were arranged with ruthless precision. Beds lined the walls, each mattress thin and hard. Names were scratched into the beams above, initials carved with meticulous care. Clara, peering through a crack one night, counted 9 sets of markings, one for each of the children born in secrecy. Their mother's identity was hidden, erased even from memory. By the time the family returned upstairs, the windows rattled with wind, though no storm had arrived. Outside, the slaves murmured warnings to one another, speaking of the underground place of shadows and the hands of the master that reached where no one should. It was in these hidden quarters that the essence of Magnolia Vale's horror solidified. The children, the women, the secrets of blood and control, all conspired to mark the plantation, not just as a home, but as a vault of sins that could never be fully erased. Tell me in the comments, could a house remember the crimes committed within it? Because beneath Magnolia Vale it did. It was a moonless night when the labor began. The hidden quarters beneath Magnolia Vale were quieter than ever, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The women who had endured years of forced obedience whispered soft prayers over the trembling mother, whose labor was unnaturally long. Candles guttered in the drafty stone chamber, casting shadows that danced like specters across the walls. The mother's cries were stifled, subdued by fear and exhaustion. yet each sound carried a weight that reverberated through the corridors. The overseer, Hiram Coyle, stood rigid at the doorway, his knuckles white around the lantern. He had seen countless births, yet none bore the oppressive gravity of this one. Even Thaddeus Barrow paused, pacing the stairwell above, his calm demeanor fractured by anticipation. When the child emerged, a hush fell over the quarters. It was a girl, but her eyes betrayed a knowledge beyond her age. Gray, like steel washed in ash, they seemed to measure the room, and the people within it. Even the master, who had prided himself on control, felt a tremor he could not name. The girl's cry was singular and piercing, echoing off the stone walls, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the hours that had preceded it. The birth changed everything. For the first time, the ledger could not contain her. The markings of heredity, carefully calculated, were present, but something else lingered, unquantifiable. In that newborn, the amalgamation of master and slave, of secrecy and cruelty, carried an energy that unsettled the plantation. The women who had birthed before knew immediately this child would not be bound like the others. Clara, witnessing from the stairs, felt a shift in her own bloodline. She realized the truth of what her father had done, and yet the child's gaze seemed to pierce her, holding both accusation and promise. It was as though the blood itself, the same blood the master sought to control, had grown teeth. By dawn, the news had spread in whispers among the quarters. The field hands, tending to the cotton, spoke of a child whose eyes burned like coals in the night. Some claimed they saw the mist curling around the nursery, carrying faint echoes of the cries of past generations. Even Thaddeus Barrow felt unease, though he masked it behind his usual cold precision. He inspected the child, turning her over in his hands, and realized that the experiment had yielded something neither ledger nor logic could predict. The balance he sought, between bloodline, obedience, and secrecy, had shifted. Would you have stayed to witness the consequences, or fled into the night? Because the blood at Magnolia Vale was no longer merely property. It had begun to fight back. The plantation's walls were meant to hold its secrets, but even stone and timber cannot contain whispers forever. Magnolia Vale's darkness leaked into the nearby countryside, carried by wind, rumor, and the occasional desperate cry that slipped past locked doors. By late 1843, the neighbors, plantation owners and tenant farmers alike, had begun to notice subtle, unsettling signs. It started with the children. Boys and girls working the fields displayed traits that were impossible to ignore. Some had the Barrow jawline, others Clara's pale eyes, all with the silent weight of awareness. Farmers passing the boundary remarked that the children seemed to watch, as if cataloging the movements of adults with an intelligence far beyond their years. Some even claimed to hear whispers drifting from the quarters, words in a strange cadence that no one recognized. Then came the nights. Travelers along the dirt roads reported flickering lights beneath the main house, as if the earth itself glowed. Screams, muffled, unnatural, and repeated, echoed across the river. Those brave enough to peek from the forest edges swore. They saw shadowed figures moving in the darkness, their shapes elongated, almost human but not entirely. One neighbor, Samuel Hargrove, rode past the main gates one late evening, drawn by a faint glow. He stopped at the edge of the fields and saw Clara at the veranda, her nightgown torn and wet from the dew. Her gaze met his, unblinking, and in that moment, he swore she spoke without words. Something in the look froze him where he stood. The next day, he tried to speak with Eleanor Barrow, hoping to uncover a reason for the strange occurrences. She answered with hollow eyes and a trembling voice, warning him only to leave and never return. Samuel's curiosity turned to dread when he heard days later that a servant had disappeared, leaving only a set of small footprints leading toward the creek, footprints that seemed to vanish midstream. Rumors grew like weeds. People whispered of the hidden quarters, the ledger, the unnatural children. Yet no one dared speak openly. The Barrows were powerful, their wealth absolute, their reputation unassailable. Still, fear carried the message, further than any voice. Magnolia Vale was not merely a plantation. It was a place where blood itself had been manipulated, where innocence was broken, and where the consequences of transgression could reach far beyond its gates. Tell me in the comments, if you had lived nearby, would you have fled or faced the truth? Because in the Deep South, some secrets refuse to remain buried, no matter how wealthy or feared the family may be. The summer of 1844 brought heat, tension, and whispers that would not be silenced. Magnolia Vale had grown oppressive, not just from the humidity but from the weight of its own history. The plantation seemed to hum with anticipation, as if the land itself had grown weary of its master's experiments. It began with a fire in the hidden quarters. No one saw it start. Some claimed the flames were born from a candle left too close to the timber. Others swore they smelled sulfur, as though the earth had ignited in judgment. By the time the overseer Hiram Coyle ran to the scene, smoke had filled every passageway. Screams erupted, muffled, desperate, and echoing against the stone walls. The women and children trapped inside clawed at the doors, at each other, at the walls themselves, while Thaddeus Barrow, standing on the veranda, appeared almost mesmerized by the inferno. Clara ran through the main hall, barefoot and wild-eyed, dragging her mother behind her. Eleanor's shawl caught fire as she fled. She collapsed in the courtyard, coughing and gasping as the heat seared the air. Outside, the enslaved ran from their cabins, carrying as many children as they could, eyes wide with terror. Flames licked the roof, turning the grand house into a silhouette of its former glory, its pillars resembling the ribs of a burning skeleton. But the fire did more than consume wood. It seemed to devour the secrecy, the lies, the unnatural bonds that Thaddeus had imposed. The ledger, or what remained of it, crumbled to ash in the hearth. Candles melted into puddles of wax, spilling light over the scorched floors. And for the first time, the cries of the hidden children mingled with the roar of the blaze, their voices unrestrained, raw, human again. Neighbors arrived at dawn to see smoke curling into the sky. Magnolia Vale was a ruin, blackened timber, warped gates, and scorched earth. Yet the children, 9 daughters, Clara and the hidden offspring, had survived. The enslaved whispered that the fire had been more than accident. It was retribution. Even Thaddeus Barrow vanished in the chaos, and no record of him was ever found. Some said the land itself swallowed him, others that he fled, broken and unrecognizable. The neighbors never spoke of what truly happened inside the flames. Only the children, standing amidst the charred remains, knew the full story. Their eyes, haunted and knowing, followed every passerby, carrying secrets no ledger had ever contained. Would you have stayed to watch? Or run before the inferno claimed you too? Because at Magnolia Vale, the fire was not just destruction, it was revelation. By the time the smoke cleared, Magnolia Vale had become a cautionary tale whispered in the back rooms of Natchez and the river ports of Mississippi. The charred remains of the house, the blackened earth, and the scarred fields bore witness to horrors the living were too afraid to name. Official records noted only an accidental fire, but those who had survived, the enslaved women and children, knew the truth. The 9 daughters, along with Clara and the hidden children, were scattered. Some were quietly taken in by distant relatives, others sold to plantations far upriver, their identities obscured to protect them from the legacy of their father. Rumor says a few escaped into the swamps, carrying with them the knowledge of their bloodline, the knowledge that they were both victims and witnesses to a family's monstrous obsession. The neighbors spoke in guarded tones. Magnolia Vale became a place of fearful respect, a plantation whose history was too dark for polite conversation. Even letters and newspapers avoided the details. The state archives make no mention of Thaddeus Barrow's crimes beyond the fire. No court records, no trial, no judgment. The scandal was buried alongside him, whispered only in the memories of those who had survived. Yet the story refused to die. Tales of children with uncanny eyes and silent knowledge circulated for decades. Plantation hands passed down warnings. Never trust the master who treats blood as property. Never look too long at children who are unusually still, and never assume that wealth shields a family from its sins. Eleanor Barrow vanished from public record shortly after the fire. Some said she died quietly in a distant town. Others claimed she lived on, haunted by the ledger and the knowledge of what her husband had done. The surviving daughters carried a legacy of silence. Some spoke little, others never at all, each bearing the invisible scar of being both witness and product of Thaddeus Barrow's obsession. Mississippi forgot, or tried to. Yet the earth remembered. The fields where the hidden children were born, the creek that ran red at dusk, and the ruins of Magnolia Vale itself held memory. Locals still say the soil is heavy there, the air carrying a faint echo of whispers, cries, and the deliberate gaze of children who knew too much. Imagine this was your family. What would you have done? Could you have escaped the cycle of silence and secrecy, or would the land have claimed you too? Because some secrets, no matter how deeply buried by fire, blood, and time, refuse to stay hidden. Magnolia Vale is proof. History is watching, and the sins of men echo long after the doors are closed.